So while people are joining, I'll just give a brief overview, do the formalities before I pass on to Piero for the interesting part of the presentation. This webinar is part of our series of virtual tutorials under the ARCHER2 service. ARCHER2 is the next UK national supercomputer service. Now, the actual installation of the hardware has been delayed by various factors, including COVID-19, of course. But the training program has started. That's actually run by Juan, who's also on the call. But as part of ARCHER2, we do a lot of training. That's all had to move online, obviously, because of current situation with coronavirus and the travel restrictions and lockdown. But what Juan has arranged as the running the program is to have more of these normally weekly virtual tutorials that are not specific to the ARCHER2 service and hopefully of general interest. So we have some virtual tutorials about the service itself, some about technical topics of general interest, but also topics from researchers who've used HPC in their own for scientific research. And today's presentation is going to be given by Piero Ferrari from KU Leuven, but he visited, I think it was King's College London, is that correct?
Yes.
Under the HPC-Europa program, which is, and we coordinate the transnational access of HPC-Europa. So HPC-Europa is a great way to visit other EU countries, or if you have a collaborator, to bring them to visit you if you're in one of the target, the host countries. So, but hopefully Piero's talk this afternoon will give you an idea of the kind of things you can achieve while you're on one of these visits. But I'll just pass over. Do you want to check that your presentation comes up okay, Piero?
Yes, I will share it now.
Great, so you should
working.
See that. And I'll pass over to Piero for his talk on the determination of cluster structures, combining infrared spectroscopy and density functional theory calculations.
Well, so thanks for the introduction. It is my honor to talk about this work today to all of you. So this work is actually a combination of some experiments as well as density functional theory calculations that I conducted. So during my visit in London, I was of course working on the theoretical side, but I will also try to explain during this talk the experiments itself and how you have to combine it with theory to determine the structures of clusters. I will also discuss briefly what are these clusters. It has nothing to do with computers. So let's just dive in. So let me start explaining what do I mean with a cluster. In this case, it's a metal cluster. So if you think in matter at different lengths, you have on one side an atom, which is a really small object, just a nucleus with some electrons around, with properties defined by the electronic structure, the energy levels of the electrons. Completely at the other side, you have a bulk, billions and billions of atoms, an uncountable number of atoms that arrange in a very specific way. You have an FCC, a VCC, a simple cubic arrangement of these atoms, and then you have an electronic structure that is not specific energy levels, but really bands, the block functions that define the properties of the system, a combination of the structure, the way the atoms arrange, plus the electronic structure. Somewhere in between, you have what we call a nanoparticle. So it's an arrangement of atoms with dimensions in the order of the nanometers, with properties that depend to some extent on the dimension, on the size, on the diameter of the nanoparticle. A metal cluster in our field is a particle that is somewhere in between an atom and a nanoparticle. So it will be a system composed of just a countable number of atoms. I can know exactly how many atoms do I have in this particle. Of course, the definition when the cluster ends and the nanoparticle starts, it's a bit vague, but the idea is that we can know exactly how many atoms do we have. I really focus on the very small particles, so I will always talk up not more than 20 atoms on the system. So why are we interested in these particles? That's because in this size regime, the properties, all sort of properties of clusters depend strongly on the number of atoms you have into the system. So if you think like in the atoms, you have a certain property, let's say the ionization energy of the system, how much energy you have to give to the atom to remove an electron. At the valve, you have an analogy to that, the work function, how much energy you have to give to the surface to remove an electron. And somehow you have to connect these two properties. And this connection from the atom to the bulk is not smooth at all, especially in the size regime of cluster, where all software properties change drastically when you add a single atom. So these are 3 examples from literature. They're all gold clusters, so particles composed of gold atoms, where you have, for instance, the radiation rates, the way these clusters emit photons. As a function of size, you see how just by changing one atom, the rates change drastically. These are reaction probabilities towards carbon monoxide, so a very different property from photon emission, but still, just by adding a single atom into the system, you change completely the way these clusters interact with CO. This is the way the cluster absorb light, the optical absorption spectrum. You see how gold 4 and gold 7, they have very different optical absorption properties. So in general, all the properties change. And this is interesting in 2 ways, from simply a scientific point of view, to understand how the properties evolve from the atom to the bulk. It's also interesting thinking towards applications, because you could find an specific cluster with a very specific property that other sizes won't have for a certain device. For instance, you can cover a photovoltaic cell with an specific cluster that will absorb the light really at the center of the emission of the sun, and then you increase efficiency, for instance. So that's why we're interested in these particles. And the size dependency of the properties of clusters depends on 2 things, as in a bulk material. So on one side, it's strongly dependent on the electronic structure of the cluster, the way the electrons are arranged into the system. This slide has a lot of information, so I will not go into too many details, but the electronic structure of a cluster can change drastically if you add a single atom. So this is a very famous example. So if you produce, in this case, sodium clusters as a function of atoms, so how many atoms you have into the system, and then you count how many you produce, so like the intensity in this figure, you will see that there are some specific sizes that for some reason are produced at higher intensities than others. And the reason of this is really related with the electronic structure of the system. So in general words, what happens is that in these particles, the valence electrons delocalize over the entire cluster, and then you have a system that is really similar to what we see like in school of a particle in a box, because these electrons delocalize over the entire cluster volume, but that is still confined because the size of the cluster is really small. So then you develop energy shells, and then when you have the right number of delocalized electrons or the right number of atoms into the system, you close a shell and you gain stability. So in the same way that noble gases are more stable than other atoms, and that changes drastically if you add a single atom. So the properties depend on one side because of the electronic structure of the system. And what is more important for what I will talk now is that they also depend strongly on the geometry. So already in the bulk that happens, so a system that arranged in an FCC or in a BCC crystallographic structure, they will have different properties. The same happened with clusters, but here the atoms in this very small size regime can arrange in very different ways when you add a single atom. So these are, from theory, the geometries of small gold clusters. You see how you change, you add a single atom, and then you have, for example, atoms that are more coordinated, or others that are not so much coordinated, and so these ones will be more reactive than others. So just by adding a single atom into the system, you change so much the structure that all properties are affected. So in general, the size dependency of the properties of these particles, it's really an interplay, a very complicated interplay between geometry and electronic structure. So if you really want to understand how these properties evolve and then how you will be able to use them in an application, you have to understand both effects at the same time. So there are different ways you can access the electronic structure from theory and from experiments. And now I'm focusing on the geometry of these particles, how the atoms arrange in the lowest energy configuration of this system. The issue here is that one easy way that you could think of will be, okay, you produce this particle, you put it on a surface, and then you come with a microscope and you look the way they arrange. But these particles are so small that you will not be able to see them with an optical microscope. You could use a more fancy technique like STM, for instance, or TEM. But then still the interaction of the particle with the surface or with the atmosphere will change the intrinsic way these particles are arranged. And that's what we want to access how these isolated particles arrange in their lowest energy configuration. So what we do is we call them experiments in molecular beams, where these particles are flying within a vacuum chamber, completely isolated from other particles, from any gas in the atmosphere, from absolutely anything. They're really isolated particles. And then we try to access this geometry. So the way we do it, first we have to produce the clusters. I will not go into too much detail here, but we use a technique called laser ablation. Essentially, we have a solid target of the material we want to use, let's say a piece of gold, a really microscopic piece of gold, and then we excite this gold with a laser. And this laser has so much energy that will ablate, will release atoms from this surface. And then we want those atoms to kind of condensate into these particles. But they have so much kinetic energy, you really produce a plasma by laser ablating, that these atoms will not interact with each other. And even if they form a particle, they will have so much energy that it will fragment immediately. So what we do is, right before we excite the system with a laser, then we introduce what we call a carrier gas, is normally helium, at a very high pressure into a very small volume where this plasma is produced here, if you see it with this hand. So the atoms of the plasma, the metallic atoms, will interact with the helium gas. It will not form a stable metal-helium complex, but the helium will actually take this kinetic energy away, and then these metallic atoms will condense into particles. We want to study sometimes bimetallic clusters, so clusters produced of two different types of metal atoms. So in our source, we actually have two independent lasers, and then we put two independent targets. And by changing, for instance, things like the relative energy between the lasers or their timings, we can change the composition of these particles. So in this way, what we produce is a molecular beam that is composed of clusters of different sizes, different compositions, and even different charge states. And they all fly together. They expand supersonically. So all this happens in a vacuum chamber, and then we have a molecular beam that flies around 1,000 meters per second. And then somehow we have to deconvolute the different sizes, because in this way we have a beam that at the same time has all these particles of different sizes, different charge states. But we really want to know the specific geometry of each specific cluster. So then we have to use a mass spectrometric technique. We use time-of-flight mass spectrometry. The idea is pretty simple. It's sketched here at the right. So we produce the clusters here at the source. Then the molecular beam flies into a second chamber in which we accelerate the particles with a potential difference towards a time-sensitive detector. So the particles fly. They fly something like 100 microseconds until they reach the detector, and actually they get deposited at the detector and then they die there. So all the experiment has to happen while they're flying. We have this 100 microseconds time window. So if we have particles of a specific mass, of different masses, they will all feel the same acceleration here. The same potential difference. So we accelerated them with a certain potential difference. But if they have different masses, they will get different accelerations, and because of that, different velocities. And so, of course, just by Newton's law, they will need different times to get into the detector. So the particles that are lighter, they will reach the detector much faster because they will feel a much stronger acceleration by this potential difference. So actually what we do is we measure as a function of time the intensities at the detector, and then we get something what you see at the bottom. So this is a typical mass spectrum of, in this case, is boron clusters. So as a function of size, initially this was time, but then we converted into mass or number of atoms. We get different peaks. All these peaks corresponds to a specific cluster of a specific size or a specific number of atoms. So by using this technique, we can deconvolute the different masses, but also the different charges, because we use a potential difference. So neutrals, particles that don't have a charge, will not feel this acceleration. Particles that have a negative charge will be actually repelled. They will fly the other way around, so they will never reach the detector. So only those particles that are positively charged, the ones we want to investigate, they will get into the detector. So that's basically the idea, how we produce them and how do we study them. How can we access now the geometry of these particles? These particles are really flying very quickly in a vacuum chamber. Of course, we cannot look at them. So what we do is we measure a specific property of these particles that is very sensitive to the geometry. This property is the vibrational modes of the cluster. So depending on the geometry, each particle will have very specific vibrational modes. So by knowing the energy at which these vibrations takes place, we can know the specific geometry of the particles. So like in solid state physics, I don't know if there's any solid state physicists in the audience, but in solid state physics, what you will do is you will record an infrared spectrum of a solid, for instance, because vibrations of atoms are normally in that energy range, where photons are in the infrared range. So to measure that in solid state physics, what you will do is you have like a sample, and then you excite with light. You know the initial intensity of the light, and then you measure how much light goes through the sample. So there will be some absorption, and so if the wavelength of the light you use has the exact energy of one of these modes, these vibrational modes, you will absorb a lot of light, and then you know that at that specific wavelength you have a vibrational mode. The problem is that this technique, this scheme, doesn't work in our case for two reasons. First, our molecular beam is really dilute. So that means that this ratio of intensities of going in and out is extremely small. So you will never be able to measure the difference between these two intensities of light. The other issue is that, as I said, the molecular beam is composed of many different sizes, many different geometries, so we will not be able to know which specific cluster is absorbing the light at that specific wavelength. So we have to forget about this. So in this way, the solid state way, what you do is you measure the change in the light due to your sample. What we do is we swap it around. So we measure instead the changes in our samples, our clusters, due to the interaction with the light. We use this technique, multiple photon dissociation spectroscopy. Basically, you have your particle, your cluster, then you excite with light. If the light has the specific wavelength of one specific vibrational mode, the system will absorb the light, will start shaking, it will become hot, like here represented in red, so now the particle is hot. And because it's isolated, all that extra energy gained by the photon absorption has to be somehow released. But remember that this particle is in vacuum, so it cannot interact with any gas, with anything. So the only way it will release that energy is actually by fragmenting. And this fragmentation process is really like the particle will kind of explode. By this explosion, the mass changes, of course, and that is something we can know from mass spectrometry, how the masses of the particles are changing. And this we can know as a function of size because of the scheme of time-of-flight mass spectrometry. In reality, we don't really excite the bare cluster. So if I want to study a gold cluster, for example, we don't excite just the gold cluster, but we first, before they interact with the light, we absorb a weakly interacted molecule, normally a noble gas. Because otherwise you have to have too many photons for the particle to fragment. But if you have a weakly bound atom, like here represented by this green circle, because it's weakly bound, you don't disturb the inner structure, the metallic structure of your system, and then the system becomes hot, and then that's kind of the fragmentation channel you study experimentally. So that's the scheme, that's the idea. How do we do it in reality? This is kind of the idea of the technique we call infrared multiple photon dissociation spectroscopy. So what we do is we produce these particles here. Into the carrier gas, we add small amounts of argon atoms. This will be our tagging elements, the ones we will use to map the fragmentation process. The clusters fly. Then there is time-of-flight mass spectrometry. So we have here like an acceleration stage. Then they reach a detector here. So we construct mass spectra. And while the particles are in the acceleration stage, we excite them with a very strong laser. Now, this laser has to be a very particular, specific laser for three reasons. It has to emit photons in the infrared or deep infrared wavelength range, because that's where the vibrational most of the particles are. It also has to be tunable, because we need to find the energies at which these vibrations are happening. So we need to be able to tune that wavelength. And also has to be extremely strong, has to be a very strong laser, because even though we have these weakly bound atoms, still you need many photons, many infrared photons to fragment the system. So we use free electron lasers for this. For the experiments I will show you now, we actually use a unique free electron laser in the world. It's called Felice. It's in the Netherlands, in Nijmegen, at the Felix laboratory. And it's unique because it's arranged in such a way that the particles fly inside the cavity of the laser. I don't know if you're familiar with the lasers, but you have a cavity inside the laser where the power is, I don't know, 100 times stronger than what is the actual outcome of the laser. So the particles really fly into the cavity of the laser. You have really, really many infrared photons, and then they come out and then they reach the detector. So what we do is we record mass spectra, like what you have here. So this is intensity as a function of mass. In this case, these are gold clusters. And we record a mass spectrum with and then one without interacting with the laser. So if the energy of the laser, the wavelength of the laser, is in resonance with one specific vibrational mode, the system will fragment, the intensity will go down, and how much it goes down, we can translate it into a specific vibration. So when the system is not in resonance, like in this case, with and without has exactly the same intensity, so only one specific system will be absorbed light. We will see that as a decrease in the mass spectrum. That like area actually goes into the fragmentation channel, and by that we can construct, as a function of the energy of the laser, an infrared spectrum, like what we have here in the bottom. So this particular cluster, gold 4 with 4 argon atoms, has 2 very pronounced vibrational modes. This is how we construct experimentally these infrared spectrums. And then it comes to the side of the theory, because here we only know at which energies the clusters are absorbed, what is the energy of these vibrational modes, but that doesn't tell us exactly what is the geometry of the system, of course. So then we have to go to a supercomputer and we have to perform density functional theory calculations. So what we do is we identify the structure of the cluster by comparing calculated infrared spectra of clusters of different isomers. So in this case, this is the same example as before. So this is the infrared spectrum of gold 4. And then what we do is we go to a computer and we say, okay, in how many ways I can arrange these 4 atoms? These isomers will not always be stable. So in this case, these are 2 ways the gold clusters can arrange in this system. There are, of course, more, but maybe some of these isomers are too high in energy, so it's impossible that they will be present in our molecular beam. So these are 2 low-lying isomers of gold 4, this tetrameric structure and then this white-shaped isomer. And then with the calculations, we see at which energies this system should vibrate, and then we construct theoretically the corresponding infrared spectrum. So in this case, blue for the tetrameric isomer, isomer 1, in red for isomer 2, and then we just compare the experiment with the calculations. So that's basically the idea. Of course, you need a lot of computations. This is a small system. It's just 4 atoms, but it's gold, so you have around 200 electrons. So performing density functional theory calculations for this system is really very heavy. And you also have to do calculations for many isomers, and then you also want to do it as a function of size, because we record at the same time the IR spectra of gold 4, gold 5, gold 6, gold 7, and so on. And the more atoms you have into the system, you have more isomers, more ways you can arrange the atoms, so sometimes you have many isomers that you have to compute. But that's essentially the idea. So now I can show you a few results of the calculations I did on my stay in London. So the experiments were done in 2 shifts at the free electron laser in Nijmegen, one 2 years ago and one a year ago. This is a work recently published by PCCP, where we studied the structures of small gold clusters. So you see, for example, here this is gold 3, where you have two very clear vibrational modes, and then if you calculate this triangular isomer, the agreement is quite good. Also in the intensities, so not only the positions. Then you have gold 4 that we have assigned this tetrameric structure. Gold 5 adopts this bow tie kind of structure. So you see the agreement is, there are of course, some deviations. It's not perfect. In this technique, you should not really trust into the intensities of the modes, because the intensities depend on the on the dipole moment, and also on how steep the potential energy surface of these particles are, and that's something that is not always so well computed by DFT, but the energies should be quite sensitive. There are, of course, some you see that the agreement is not perfect, but still you have all this mode and all other isomers miss completely the structure. You have others that the intensity goes down, but then still you can assign quite well gold 9, gold 7. Then you have some systems like gold 8, in which we believe that you have coexistence of different isomers. So here we have calculated 4 isomers, but you see that they are really, really close in energy. So that means that most probably in the molecular beam, you really have the 4, not necessarily, but probably these 3 isomers coexisting into the molecular beam. So we did this for pure gold clusters, and then we were also very interested in how adding a second atom, which is not gold, a dopant atom into the system changes these structures, because this really changes all properties into the system. So we investigated, and this is really the work I did at London, which is still not finished. So it's investigating how palladium dope changes the structures of the gold clusters. Because in the past, we investigated many different properties of palladium dope gold clusters. We investigated their reactivities towards different molecules. We investigated the intrinsic stability, their optical absorption, their radiative cooling, but we didn't really know exactly their geometries, only based on theory. So this is a confirmation that the geometries we thought they are correct. Actually, in some cases, we realized that the structures we thought just based on theory were wrong. So for example, this is the case of palladium gold 3. So you have here 4 atoms into the system. So the pure gold cluster was 2-dimensional, this tetrameric structure, but doping changes the system into a 3-dimensional cluster. So you see we tried 2 isomers. It matched really well with this small pyramid. So it's definitely not a planar structure. Then this is the case of gold 7. As I said, when you have more atoms, you have more isomers as well. So we try more isomers. Still, we have very good agreement with ISO 1, the blue curve. This is another example, gold 9. So that's the way we do it. Of course, this is a work that is still in progress. So because it's really heavy computations, you have many isomers. You also have to check quite carefully the level of theory you will use for the density functional theory calculations. So it's really a lot of work that you have to do. So in conclusion, the size-dependent properties of clusters, these particles in this really small size regime, depend strongly on the geometry of these particles. It's not easy to determine those geometries. So one way, it's not the only, but I would say it's one of the best ones, is to use infrared multiple photon dissociation spectroscopy in combination with density functional theory calculations. The technique has advantages, also has some weak points, but in general is one of the best ways to determine this, combining theory and experiment. And I show this as a representative example of pure and palladium dot gold clusters. So the acknowledgements, so the people in Leuven, the people in Nijmegen and in Felix, and also at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, because we have done a lot of this type of experiments in these laboratories. Also the people at King's College been working when I was working a few months ago, and of course Cyrus, HPC, and my own founding. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you have questions. Yeah, it's all silent now, so I don't know.
So, thanks everyone. Hopefully you can hear me again.
Yes, now I can. Yeah.
So if anyone wants has any questions, they can use the chat. You can use audio if you want. but often chat works best if people have connection problems. And I had a quick question. You used Cirrus, the machine that we host at EPCC.
Yes.
Was that relatively straightforward? Was all the software just there? The transition from another machine?
Yes. So yeah, the software. I can hear some voice. I was saying yes. So for these calculations, I used MWChem. It was software already installed at Cyrus. I also thought initially to use another software that was not installed, but essentially all these softwares works well. So yeah, it was super easy. Yeah, it was not issue.
And the scale, and maybe you said, but how many? I mean, what scale did you typically run out in terms of number of cores and such like?
Yes, so I did initially a benchmark analysis. That was the first thing I did. For the more heavy computations, I used not more than 3 nodes, I think, and usually they were running. Let's say for the largest system I used, that was palladium gold 9, and then with a few argon atoms around, maybe in 70 hours or so with 3 nodes, or maybe a bit less.
Okay, so that's about 100 CPU cores on
Yes.
Yes. Yeah,
so it's not really that I had to do extremely heavy calculations, but I had to do many of them because I had to check many isomers and yeah.
So that's really interesting though, because there are other questions I'll get onto, but that is one of the reasons that Cirrus was installed, was to, I mean, the system, the largest system, the national system in Archer, is there for jobs on very large numbers of cores because it has a very expensive interconnect. But Cirrus is there to do types of jobs like that, which require, hundreds of cores, but lots of jobs for the capacity.
Yes. Yes. So it was perfect for me, basically.
I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's a question from Helen Duncan. Can you see? I'll read it. Actually, I was wondering if you do any screening of the potential isomer candidates before you run the actual DFT calculations.
Yes, this is a good question. Yes, of course. So I don't start immediately with the most heavy level of theory for the calculations. So initially I did a benchmark analysis also of the level of theory I was going to use. But usually I was initially selecting a small basis set and not the most heavy exchange correlation functional to do a screening of different isomers. Then I was arranging them as a function of their energies. And then on the already optimized structures, I was doing a re-optimization at the heavy level of theory, and then applying the calculation of the vibrational modes, which is also quite heavy calculations. Of course, yes, I was doing this screening of isomers. But you have to be very careful with that, because I saw many times that in the low level theory compared with the high level theory, the order of the isomers was completely different. So as I said in our previous work, sometimes we assign some isomers, and now I realize that those were actually not the isomers that we had in our molecular beam, and that's because maybe we were using a too low level of theory. But because if you don't have any experimental data to compare, you cannot be absolutely sure. You cannot trust 100% with 100% certainty on the theory. It was most of the times correct, the one we assigned before, but now we're absolutely sure because we have the experiment. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
There's also a question from Lisette. She's asking, thanks for the talk. Do you consider initial input geometries by hand or use random structure energy rankings for your basis?
Yeah, this is also a good question. For the very small systems, I tend to construct them by hand. When you have 3 or 4 atoms, you can do that by hand. When you have like 10 atoms, and especially if you have a dopant atom there, then you have really many different configurations. So by doing it by hand, you can very easily miss the actual true minima in the potential energy surface. So no, this work was actually a collaboration from some time ago, especially the palladium doped gold clusters, because first we investigate these particles, the intrinsic stability of them, this electron delocalization and magic numbers. And then from theory, we had already the structures, but only based on theory. And then a collaborator, Roy Johnston from Birmingham University, he did a really thorough search of low-lying isomers. So what I did now is I took, like, let's say the 20 or maybe the 10 more stable ones that he found, and then I was doing a re-optimization of them, and then calculating the vibrational modes and compare with the experiment. Yes.
Coming from Scott Woodley, it's actually a project I know the name of because he was involved in this, asking you could upload your published isomers to this WASP database hosted at UCL. I'm
not sure what this database is, but of course, I mean, once the work is published, we can of course we could save the XYZ coordinates, for instance, of the most stable ones.
Scott can say more, but I understand it's there to make sure that people can reuse results easily. They don't have to have to recompute the data. Structures already been computed.
Yeah. So always that we publish this work, we add the XYZ coordinates at supporting information, but then you really have to find our papers. So of course, but once it's published, we can release just the coordinates of the system. That's not an issue. Yeah, I will look into it because it's something that we discuss a lot, especially among experimentalists, that in many works, theory works, the actual XYZ coordinates are not really published, so you just have a picture of the structures. But then if you want to use them, it's sometimes very tricky to really know what is the structure. You just have a single picture. So yeah, I could look into it, yeah.
So are there any more questions? So, yes, so Scott's saying you also upload the DOI of your paper,
yes.
So it's a good publicity for that. Great.
Yeah. So far the pure gold clusters is published, but not yet the palladium doped ones. We're still working on that.
So, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank Piero for a great talk. Again, I mean, I've been saying this at the end of a lot of our presentations, but you know, we're finding ourselves in strange times, but it is remarkable how the technology has come on. When we started the ARCHER service maybe 5 or 6 years ago, it was Claire used to run these sessions, and it was an enormous amount of effort to get them working. And I know she put a lot of effort into setting the session up, but people joining and stuff and they're able to ask questions across the whole of Europe is a really, really important thing to keep in touch. Hopefully we'll all be able to meet each other face to face in the near future. Piero was telling me that in Leuven things are easing up a bit, and hopefully in the UK, well, at least in Scotland, maybe in a couple of weeks we'll start to get a bit more freedom, but of course it has to wait till it's safe. So, but thank everyone for attending, and thanks very much for your presentation. And
thank you very much.
Hope everyone stays safe, and if you're interested, where you joined on the ARCHER2 website, Juan and Claire will advertise the upcoming events in the series, which cover a wide range of topics, not just, I mean, there's scientific ones, but also programming and more HPC specific. So thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much.
This will appear shortly when we've had a time just to edit it, and I'll put it up online. Great. All the best.
Bye. Thank you. Bye bye.